Hi, everyone. Welcome to Against Gravity, your favorite podcast that brings you thought-provoking conversations with change makers, game changers, and legacy builders. I'm your host, Henry Devon. This podcast is powered by Picture. Picture is your Afrocentric visual content provider, where you're looking at contemporary images of African people and communities to change the narrative, project a positive picture of how Africans are changing the world. So go on picturestalk.com and download the images and use for your storytelling, your marketing, and your public relations. On today's episode of Against Gravity, I have Rya Kuewor. He's a refugee and integration consultant with over 6 years experience in working in higher and marginalized education in Ghana, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Kenya, and 4 years of working on refugee education with a special focus on economic and social integration. He is someone I admire so much, and I can't wait to get into this conversation so we get to know more about Rya. Today he runs Rya, which is the Refugee Integration Organization in Ghana and Brazil, working with refugees, internally displaced people, and persons of concern. Rya provides people with entrepreneurship training, business incubation, and personalized mentorship. His passion for work stems from having been homeless once and never having been formally educated. So for him to be doing so well in this area, I am intrigued, just like you listening, to know his story. Rya, thank you so much for joining Against Gravity.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Henry.
Well, welcome to the show. I will allow you to describe yourself in a few words beyond the profile I've just read of you. Who is Rya Kuewor?
Thank you. So, thanks again for the opportunity. I would say I've recently found the Christian faith, and so I'd say that I'm a child after Christ's own heart, and my core values, which I think describe me perfectly, because my work titles may change and my area of work focus may change also, but my core values will stay the same. My core values are love, kindness, integrity, and honesty. And I think this describes the kind of person that I am.
Oh, wow. I always love people who have personal values and they live by them. So it's really interesting. And for me, it's really rare to find young Africans who are committed to improving the lives of refugees and migrants on our home turf, on our continent. So tell us a bit about your growing up, your story.
So I was homeschooled my entire life. I was born and bred in Ghana and raised in Accra. And I was homeschooled my entire life by my father. He did this along with the rest of my other siblings. And I truly have never had any formal education. At some point, I thought I was going to be a doctor because I've always wanted to be useful and helpful to people. But somewhere along the line, I figured out that you could do it through other means. At home, I focused on languages and etymology. And then later I discovered behavioral economics and economics. And that's what I majored in at home. In 2012, I became homeless for a few months. And it was through that segue that I got to working with refugees, which we'll touch on soon.
Definitely, but I'm interested in why you were homeless for a few months. What actually happened?
The stupid reason. I told my father that I wanted to become a doctor, and he refused. So it's not usual for African parents to refuse that their children become doctors, but he refused because he didn't believe in formal education, for one thing, and he was raising us to become yogis like himself. He himself was homeschooled by his mother, and he was doing very well for himself. And so this was the aspiration that he had for us. And so through that, I left home. He didn't kick me out. I left home, and I stayed homeless for about 6 months.
Wow, interesting. I mean, I have a similar story. My dad also wanted me to be a doctor. And I was like, you know what? If you want me to be a doctor, take me out of Ghana to study medicine.
Oh, my word.
And I think that scared him. I put a condition on the table and it was like, okay, I'm not ready to fund that.
Yeah, that is very daunting.
And I went straight to read communication. So that's really interesting. And you speak 9 languages, local and international languages. Tell me about how you're able to learn 9 languages by living in Ghana?
Right. So, I mean, if you grew up in Ghana, you're most certainly going to be a polyglot by some in some way or other. My first language was Ewe from the Volta region. I remember I only started learning English when I was around 7 or 8 years old. So Ewe was my first language, and then I learned English, and then I learned Tree. My Tree accent is terrible, but my grammar is good. And then I learned Tree, and Gan we spoke at home also, so that was an easy grab, and Pidgin was easy as well. But Hausa, I remember I learned during the time that I was homeless. I hung around with a lot of people who spoke the language, and so through inference and talking to myself, using the words that I'd learned for the day or for the week, I had a grasp of the language. And after about 6 months, I realized that I could have conversations in Hausa, and so that's how that happened. With German, I studied it at home. My motivation was this young lady in my neighborhood that I was in love with. And I thought, okay, let me learn a new language to woo her with. And so I had this I had this English-German dictionary called the Langenschneids English-Deutsch Wörterbuch. And I learned German with that. I remember that I would put in 10 to 17 hours a day for 4 months. And after that, which time I could speak German. Now, French, I learned French through YouTube and this radio station. It's next to Atlantis Radio on the dial, called Radio France Internationale. And it took me 5 months to learn. I learned it because I was getting work in Mali, and one of the requirements was that I spoke French fluently before I could go. So that's how I came to learn the languages that that I know. After French, I realized that I could probably do this with any language that I wanted. So for my 30th birthday, I'm learning Mandarin as a present to myself.
Wow. Don't you get confused at times with all of these languages? Don't you like intermix some of them?
Well, I mean, sometimes it depends on the ones that I'm speaking. So if I'm having an argument in German, sometimes I may throw in some French words by accident and vice versa. Or if I'm having an argument in Hausa, I might throw in some ga by accident. But largely, no, they don't get confusing. And I make sure that I maintain retention of the ones that I use the least by associating some days with speaking to myself solely in that language. And so I always at least have the vocabulary that I already know.
Oh, interesting. There's nothing you can do. Nothing should limit you. I keep saying I have to move to Ivory Coast to learn French and then move to Spain to learn Spanish. I keep giving myself these excuses because I want to sort of immerse myself in the culture and learn quickly. But it looks like you're way ahead of the curve. Wow, great. I'm really proud of you on that. And I know you're a really good reader. You're a voracious reader, and you also read incredibly well. I've seen some of snippets of your audio reading reels on Instagram, and I think you can start an audiobook if you want, because it's really clear. It's interesting for me. How did you start to read? And just behind you, for those watching on YouTube, we can see racks of books. How did reading become a deep part of your person?
Well, it was from my homeschooling, actually. We had a mini library at home, about 4,000 books. And I remember that our father would have us read 2 books a week and write 4 essays per book. And so that's where the reading culture came from. That's how I came to read nearly 2,000 books, because we did that for so very long. But I came to like reading after my father would have me read stories to him. And so that's where the idea of reading came from. But it's always been part of our family culture. I have older sisters who've perhaps read more books than I have by virtue of being older and by virtue of having the 2 book a week thing starting for them at a much earlier age. Yeah, so these are a few of my books. There are about 200-300 books here. The rest are in storage.
I mean, you've met a lot of people who've been traditionally educated. They've been to schools, institutions, and you were homeschooled. What difference have you noticed from your perspective?
I've noticed that people who are traditionally educated find it very difficult to pivot to other things, to unlearn what they've learned or unlearn the ways in which they've learned. Because I've also realized that a lot of the learning that goes on in our traditional formal education settings have to do with rote learning, and it's very difficult for people to break out of studying for an exam. I've never taken exams in my life. We've never been required to, and we've always had the versatility of shifting between what we're either majoring or minoring in. I mentioned earlier that I started out with etymology and languages, and then I discovered behavioral economics and economics, and that's what I focused on. And even till this day, it's one of my biggest superpowers to be able to do a deep dive into what I need to learn and put the hours into it and come out knowing that thing. And that's the main difference between people who've gone on to study for a certificate or a degree and me, I think.
Right. And this is Against Gravity. Our guest is Rya Kuewor, and he is the founder of REAL, Refugee Integration Organization. And today's podcast is Fighting for Change for Refugees and Migrants. So it's really interesting. And let's delve now into the work you do for refugees and migrants, REAL. You've worked in several countries. You've spent time with refugees in Kenya, Mali, Burkina Faso, many others. You know, people have a stereotypical image of refugees in their minds, you know, and that, you know, compel them sort of to mistreat, to marginalize migrants. What have you learned about refugees and displaced persons in the last 10 years since you've been working or reading and researching into this area that you feel people get wrong?
I think it's that we think refugees are helpless and even though it's not been explicitly said, don't really know anything. And I had the same thinking myself the first time that I went to teach in a refugee camp. I remember in 2013, I was working with the Open University of West Africa at the time, and I got a subcontract from this school in Switzerland called École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. And the subcontract was to instruct in entrepreneurship in the Krisan and Ampane refugee camps near the Ghana-Ivory Coast border. And I went into the camps with a messianic attitude, as though I was going to save or liberate them or something like that. And my first class had people with advanced degrees in biochem. And it struck me that they had lives and responsibilities and respect before they became refugees. And I think that's the largest misconception around refugees, that they are helpless, that they are a helpless community, and they are an unbankable community, and we can't trust them with anything. It's not so.
Good. Some myth busters there from Rio for us. And in honor of World Refugee Day last year, you published a poem titled Khalid the Refugee, where Khalid personified every refugee in Ghana. And when you're writing this really poignant poem, what message did you want to send?
My disappointment of the fact that Ghanaian law states that refugees can live and work as you and I, as Ghanaians, do, and own land and naturalize and marry and that sort of thing. But somehow, since as far back as 96 till now, they're still living in refugee camps, still subject to abject degrees of poverty. And I really wanted to express my disappointment in that, and to show that more could be done in this area. I don't understand why or how refugees, especially in Ghana, where the laws are applicable to helping them integrate, are still living in camps in the conditions that they're living in. I think it's dreadfully disappointing and speaks very poorly of our management skills.
In the same poem, in the paragraph themed "My Country Free and Safe," I mean, these words struck me. Akwaba, of course, you're welcome here. You're all welcome here. Come, follow me. This is now your new home. You may live here, you may work here, you may marry, own land, naturalize, move into my cities, but alas, I have only my words and my policies for you. Yours is a problem, dire, true, but not large enough to merit true attention and help. You can leave anytime you please. You may not have the means, but you have my permission. I'm sure you will find help elsewhere. For though you are in isolation, you are amidst so many. For me, this paragraph really struck me because you are sort of calling out, Ghana's double standards when it comes to openly accepting refugees, but not doing enough in terms of policy, in terms of action to alleviate their suffering and marginalization. What's your assessment of how Ghana has handled refugees so far, from Bujumbura to the Ampane refugee camps in the country?
I always get in trouble for speaking out about these things for obvious reasons. But I have a bit of an activist lifestyle inside of me, and so it's difficult to not talk about these things and to not to not call attention to them. Also, I think with regards to Bujumbura, it's an especially difficult place to manage because the refugees there have intermarried with Ghanaians so much indeed that it's difficult to differentiate who refugees are and who nationals are. And so at that camp, at least, certain levels of integration have been achieved. And I know that the UNHCR Ghana office has been working tirelessly to help them repatriate, and they've done this for several thousands of them, and the process is still ongoing. But for the other camps, which are considered, for Ghana's purposes, high-level camps, Fatenta, Krisan, and Payne, they are not receiving nearly as much intervention as they could be. I mean, even during the COVID era, hardly any PPEs went out to the camps, hardly any attention has been given to the camps. Inefficient economic integration measures have been meted out to them for years and years, and nothing much has been changed in that regard. And I think we absolutely can do better if we wanted to. I don't think it's beyond us. I think it's, and we'll get to this towards the end, but I think it's a question of convenience, unfortunately.
Right. For me, I thought that was a diplomatic assessment. You don't want to get into some good trouble. Thank you for that. We are talking fighting for survival, refugees and migrants here on the Against Gravity podcast. I'm speaking to Rya Kuewor. Rya, you established RIO, which is Refugee Integration Organization, to help refugees leave the camps, to create livelihoods and fulfill their full individual potential. How is RIO going as an organization so far, and what's your progress like?
Well, it's going really well. It's going really well so far. Just a bit of history. So we unofficially started in 2013. We began with helping refugees fund tertiary education programs, so helping them get their bachelor's degrees and that sort of thing. But on a very, very low scale, because this was coming from my pockets. So there was only so many refugees that I could personally fund. So we started with that. And then we moved to entrepreneurship training and mentoring. And then we moved to, in 2016, we got registered and we started doing English as a second language for refugees in the Dadaab camp in Kenya and the Krisan camp in Ghana. And then we expanded those services to the Cidade de Deus favela, it's a slum in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where we were instructing in Portuguese as a second language and entrepreneurship for migrants from Haiti. We did that for about a year and a half. And then one morning in Nairobi, I get a call from one of the refugees from Ghana, and he said, "You know, we don't need your language program." And my heart sank after he said this. But then the next thing he said gave me a little hope. He said, "We just need money." And so in 2019, we created a microfinance program for refugees. And it was the first refugee managed microfinance program in the world. The purpose of the microfinance program was to test, there's this myth that refugees are not a bankable community. And we wanted to give it to them to manage, to show the world that indeed they are a bankable community. And indeed, given ownership, they will manage programs and create their own solutions. And that's what happened. We received a 97% return on the investment that we made in the microfinance program for refugees. And that led us to where we are now with unconditional basic income. We're running unconditional basic income programs in the Krisan, Ampane, and Kakuma refugee camps. These are all refugee managed. For the Ampane camp, it's a It's a $2 million fund where refugees there are getting $1.50 a day every day for free. And in the Krisan camp, it's a $500,000 fund where they're also getting $1.50 a day for free. And in the Kakuma camp in Kenya, it's also a $2 million fund. And this is all managed by refugees themselves. We just supervise from a distance. And so that's how the programs are going with Rio. I'm happy that in all our quests, we've been able to break a lot of myths around refugees managing their own solution and break a lot of myths around the inability to enter refugee camps and create sustainable solutions that actually help improve the lives of refugees.
Wow, that's interesting. And doing this, I know you come across some challenges because refugees are also really diverse. They are not just one unit. They are from different places. They may even speak different languages. What are some of the challenges you face with, implementing some of the programs like the Universal Basic Income Program and some other initiatives? What challenges do you face with refugees?
Well, not directly from the refugees themselves. Believe it or not, a lot of our challenges are more bureaucratic than stemming from the refugee camps themselves, or because there's a lot of there are different, how do I say, processes to go through before you can start implementing things in and around refugee camps, because they are UN protected facilities first and foremost. And so a lot of our challenges are bureaucratic and not from the refugees themselves, in as much as there are different cultures and language groups within the camps. My team represents several language groups, and we try as much as possible to build personal relationships with all of our refugee beneficiaries. And so they have a direct line to me, and they call me as late as 2 a.m. in the morning to troubleshoot issues and that sort of thing. So that access and that rapport has been created. And so lots of the problems that we have are not from the camps themselves, but are largely bureaucratic.
I can imagine. Interesting. Now let's talk about the greater issue of migration. I know you're helping a lot of migrants and refugees on the African continent, but if you've noticed, there's been an exodus of young Africans. A lot of migrants are leaving Africa, going to Europe. Each day we see tens of thousands go on this dangerous journey by sea, through the Mediterranean from Libya to Europe in search of greener pastures. In as much as your focus is on domestic, integration of refugees on the continent, as a researcher in this field, what do you think are the solutions to this issue? How should leaders handle it?
Well, I mean, a lot of the reasons that migrants or people are migrating to these countries, to Europe, is because of either poverty, abject poverty in their own countries, or they're fleeing from some form of persecution. And you'll know that last year a new migration pact for the EU was launched and ratified. And I mean, we're grateful that they are looking into this issue and creating new rules around it. But if you take a closer look at the pact, it looks as though they are shifting responsibilities and putting a curtain around the problem as opposed to truly solving it, because you'll see that migrants are still being heavily detained, and the processing time for new arrivals has shortened. They say it's shortened so that they can more efficiently treat these cases. But what happens in those events is that a lot of migrants are returned, because they then say that their claims for migrating are not founded or are not valid. But then there aren't any external supervisors that are able to verify if these claims are indeed not valid or not. And so solved, though the new pact has been ratified. Migrants are just being detained, and even though they're geographically on European soil, they're not allowed into the EU. And so it's, to put it plainly, politics has gotten in the way of helping people. And again, it goes back to what is convenient for people and for organizations to do, because it isn't for a lack of resources that the EU, for instance, cannot properly process and house these migrants. It's more a thing of inconvenience. And right now it seems as though the pact is doing what is convenient for the EU, and that's unfortunate.
Very unfortunate. What can African leaders do? Because people are leaving because they are being persecuted, because of instability, because of economic issues. What should African leaders do, Rya?
I mean, I'm always reluctant to speak on this because I think the response has been iterated over and over and over again. It all comes back to corruption and just people doing the wrong thing, blatantly doing the wrong thing. You know, and you go to Europe and you see these people's our African leaders' properties all across Europe and the wealthiest neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And they schooled in Ivy League universities, and it's not you and I who will teach them to govern and good governance. Everyone knows what needs to be done, but no one's doing it because no one's checking anyone's injustice. You know, it leads back to corruption and bad governance. But that's not likely to change, unfortunately. I don't mean to sound hopeless or like a wet blanket, but those are just the facts of the matter.
Oh, you're being honest, but it's really sad to hear.
It is.
Let's still stay with the global situation of refugees. I know you were a global lead of equity and inclusion for refugees and migrants of the Global Shapers community. And you published an address, a really short one, ahead of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland last year, I think, calling on global leaders to look at migrants as people who have skills, can contribute to their economies, and create lasting change. I wanted to focus on the US for a moment because we've seen a lot of migrants moving from South America to the US, and they've not been treated so well in the last 5 years, including children who are put in cages. How do you feel of how the US has handled refugees and migrants at its border?
It's heartbreaking and nothing short of that. There's absolutely no excuse for what's gone on and going on in the US with regards to treating migrants at the border. There's no justification whatsoever for it. It's inhumane. It's completely inhumane. Till date, a lot of the families of the children who are separated from their parents have not been found because records have not been kept. And so this means that those children, though they have parents, will go without proper parenting because of this. It's atrocious, really. It's atrocious. And unfortunately, also, no one's holding anyone accountable for these things. I mean, no one went to jail for it. Not that I've heard of. No one's been prosecuted for it in any way. And these things keep happening. I think at the very least, what we can do is to stay informed about them and talk about them.
Definitely. Rya Kuewor is my guest on Against Gravity. We are talking fighting for survivor refugees and migrants. He is a refugee and migrant consultant and co-founder of the Refugee Integration Organization, RIO. Rya, I'm thinking we've faced a global health crisis. I'm wondering, how has COVID really affected refugees? How did refugees, the people you interacted, how did it really change them? How did it affect them on a personal level?
I mean, things got much, much worse for refugees. I mean, you and I suffered. Things were hampered for the both of us. Things were hampered for everyone else around the world who, because of COVID. But for people who are stuck in refugee camps and detention centers and people who are stateless and just generally persons of concern, things were much, much worse indeed. I wrote an article that the World Economic Forum published about my theories on how the refugee camp model is dead and how it should be abolished. It's supposed to be a very short-term solution to the mass movement of people because of persecution or fear of life. And now it's turned into a more systemic, institutionalized thing. And I've written about how the camp model is dead. And this is one of the reasons why it should be abolished. People are just stuck in camps, unable to receive the help that they need. Even with vaccinations, refugees are going to be some of the last people who receive vaccinations, and that's That's really unfortunate. We, in response to COVID and refugees and migrants, we opened a corporate social responsibility arm of Rio a couple of weeks back, where we're giving 5,000 migrants in India $1 a day to help. These are people who have who've come to different cities in search of work, and because of restrictions in the country now, they're unable to go back, and they have no work, and they're literally starving to death. And so we're giving them $1 a day to help with the COVID crisis in India. And that's one of the ways in which Rio is responding to that.
Awesome. And I'm thinking, like, going forward, looking at the future from now, how can we better the lives of refugees and migrants? How can someone like me, what action can I take, someone listening who is moved by the work you do, what can we do to improve the quality of life of refugees and migrants if governments are not really coming to their aid?
Well, Henry, truth be told, you're doing it already. You are, at least, by talking about this, by highlighting these stories, by making sure that the word gets out, because there's only so much that those of us who work directly in the space can do. But you, who has the platform to tell these stories and to shed light on what the refugees are going through and how they are innovating around their own solutions, this is a great help. And I think to everyone who's able to do these sorts of things, the onus is on us to stay involved and to talk about them, because where we have knowledge in a certain area and where we're talking about it, it's really hard for injustice to hide in those corners, because then they become public. So this is what we need help with. This is what we need help with. Advocacy is definitely another area in which we need help. I mentioned that a lot of the issues that we face around refugee integration are unfortunately bureaucratic, but we are breaking the borders around that. So, for instance, the UBI programs that we run, the unconditional basic income programs that we run, we run them using cryptocurrencies. So all this money that we have available for refugees and migrants, that's I think $6.5 million in total, is crypto funded through our partnerships with the Celio Foundation and Impact Market. And this involves our refugee beneficiaries claiming this money through smartphones. And we noticed that there are different levels of poverty within the refugee camps, where not everyone is able to afford a smartphone. And so one of the things that we did is we introduced USSD integrations, which means that even refugees with feature phones are able to dial a short code and receive this cryptocurrency directly into their mobile money wallets. And so I'm especially proud of this innovation, because it's the first time in the history of refugees that it's been done, unconditional basic income through cryptocurrencies and delivered through mobile money.
Oh, that's amazing. And so how can I contribute? I know you said mobile money, you also mentioned crypto. So where can we go if we want to contribute to this fund?
If you'd like to donate to the fund, to our website, integraterefugees.org. All infos for donation are there.
All right, integraterefugees.org. So if you want to take action today beyond advocacy, you want to contribute, donate, integraterefugees.org will give you all the details too. Now, my really final question to you, and I mean, one part of this particular podcast, even before I come to my final, is the Against Gravity moment. And Against Gravity moment is really a key part of your life that you feel you experienced the greatest challenge and you overcame it. And you are here today. So, Rya, what is your biggest Against Gravity moment?
The very beginning, having that conversation with my father that I I wanted to study medicine and become a doctor. I think that was the most difficult thing that I've ever done in my entire life. Um, I've been stuck in different countries. I lived in Mali during their war. I was in Burkina Faso during their coup d'etat. I've been through stuff, but the most difficult thing that I've ever done was telling my father that I wanted to be a doctor, knowing that he would refuse. So I think that was my big against gravity moment.
Definitely, that conversation is always chilling because whichever way it goes, it could change the course of your life for a very long time.
Yeah, and my father was a very how do I describe him? He was a very intimidating man. He had a big white beard,
Mm-hmm.
and he was always home. He wore a cloth around his waist, and he was special advisor to a few of our presidents. So he had a very intimidating presence. It was the worst conversation ever.
I can imagine. Rhea, for every person listening, especially someone who is homeless maybe for a while or permanently, or someone who's not had formal education yet, who's listening to the podcast, what would be your final message to them? What would you tell them? I mean, if it was your young self who was homeless during the few 6 months you were standing in front of you, what message will you send to them?
Honestly, that you can study almost anything if you figure out the way that you study it, what methods work for you, and truly, some of the most subtle things that have gotten me where I am today is just being polite and being kind. It would shock you. It would absolutely shock you, the doors that have opened for me because I was unknowingly polite and kind. It would entirely shock you. I cannot express that enough. It's such a rare commodity these days. People are just not very polite, very kind any longer. But these things do open doors, and nothing is beyond studying. If it was done, it can be learned.
If it was done, it can be learned. Thank you so much, Rya Kuewor,
Absolutely.
co-founder of RIO, Refugee Integration Organization. He is a refugee and migrant integration consultant doing amazing work to help displaced persons, find their food, create livelihoods for themselves and, sustainable ways of making money to look after themselves and their families. Thank you for appearing on Against Gravity. It's a
Thank you
pleasure.
for having
For you at home or anywhere you're listening or watching us from, thank you for joining this episode of Against Gravity, which is brought to you by Picha. Check out pichastock.com, PICH stock.com for all the images you need. This t-shirt I'm wearing is part of Afrofem because it's
Ooh,
part of our Afrofem collection we launched to
amazing.
support women of color. So check out that collection and use for all your storytelling, for your websites, for your blogs, whatever, and change the narrative. So let me leave you with a quote from Rhea. It says, "If it can be done, it can be learned." Thanks so much. My name is Henry Deben. Join us on our next episode for another life-changing conversation. Bye.